at it.
Sorry for
Hello, Anders.
giving you a break.
You must have just come in the door and sat down, basically, right?
Yep, literally. Yep, just ran in from the bus, got home.
Okay, well, then kudos to you for being able to do that. We all just listened to the interview, and as usual, you're fantastic. The way you present everything is so clear because, unlike me, where I go into abstracts very quickly, you tend to bring everything back down to examples that people can really get into and dig into, like AI that is helping little old ladies across the street and things like that. So that's perfect. And I think we also got a bunch of good questions here, and I see Mallory just
Even
popped up
better.
again. So she can take
Can you
over
hear me now?
her job.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So where did we leave off after I joined? Are we going to start with our first question?
You can go ahead with whichever questions you want. Anders is here.
All right, and just to remind everybody, you can ask your questions in the YouTube live stream chat, or you can call into call.carboncopies.org or the number 415-455-3017. The first question that we have is from Roman Sitlu. Even today, there are some people who are both capable of recursive self-improvement, like adopting the new mind-enhancing technology, and have strong misanthropic tendencies. Basically, in a way, they're biological, non-friendly AGIs. What can we do about this scenario?
I think we actually have a surprising amount of good tools at our disposal. After all, one reason we behave ourselves is that our mothers told us various things that we should be doing. And that's a form of social software. We have other forms of social software we get when we get enculturated, as well as police, reputation, various forms of market solutions. And many of these things constrain us to a tremendous degree. Then, of course, if you try to do recursive self-improvement through enhancement today, it's quite limited. No amount of smart drugs and meditation and getting the best apps are going to make you tremendously more effective than just somebody who's really smart or specialized. And you're not going to exactly beat Deep Blue and even without actually having a computer on your side. But the deep part of the question is, how do we handle when it becomes easier to make powerful individual minds? And I think in general, we do that by having a lot of minds that are partially constrain each other and systems of minds. Because generally, systems of minds are much more powerful than individuals. So to just take a little parable here, we have Eliezer Yudkowsky's interesting AI boxing experiments, where he practically demonstrated that actually convincing people to let out a possibly unfriendly AI out of a box was pretty doable. If you're smart enough and glib enough, you can talk your way out. This is impressive, except why don't prisoners do this all the time? Why don't we see more prisoners talking their way out of prison? And the answer is, of course, well, quite often they talk their way past one of the prison wardens, but there are others. There is a system. There are careers of being prison chief and warden that are dependent on prisoners not talking their way out too much. And that actually makes actual prisons surprisingly effective in keeping even the most clever prisoners in. Not perfect, but quite well. So I do think we can do the same kind of system management. It's not like we want to only upload the saints, so we don't even have a good yardstick of saintlyhood, and maybe the saints won't stay saintly once they're in the computer either. But you don't want to have just one mind.
Great. Does anyone want to add to that, or should we move on to the next question?
I think Anders pretty much answered the whole question, unless you wanted to dig into the detailing that Roman did when he pointed out, well, people who want to self-improve may already feel that they are perfectly fine at eliminating a huge part of humanity in the future or something like that. If you could restate that properly. Or Mallory, sorry, maybe I didn't make myself clear. I thought you could maybe read out that part of the
Or
question.
I could just try to get at what I think that question embodies. So really ruthless sociopaths and people think that the world would be better off with just me around. Certainly psychologically they exist. The vast majority of them are not very good at doing anything, because by virtue of being so misanthropic and sociopathic, they rarely can acquire the resources. I think the intuition we have is, oh, what if we got a technological mean, that pill that just makes you essentially godlike? At that point, we would be in trouble if we got it. But the problem is they're probably not first in the queue, most of them. The real problem might, of course, still be the scenario where you have successful sociopaths, successful misanthropes, or who have just run into a lot of resources, and they would get empowered. But again, the question is, why aren't particular billionaires wiping out everybody else and running the kingdom? Well, to some degree, they still need other people. But even there, you can actually replace people with consultancies, etc. The actual problem is, of course, societies, in order to remain rich and functional, are quite complex. You can't actually run all the parts. So the people who are just interested in wealth and power, they're relatively safe. They might distort society in other ways. So the only case we need to be worried about is the really misanthropic person who gets very powerful. But I do think the scaling of power isn't in favor of this. Once upon a time, that the Medici family, they were wealthier than essentially the principality they were running. The Rothschilds were rivaling the nations, Europe, in wealth and power. But meanwhile, they were wealthier than the United States. These way powerful, rich people, relative to organizations of people like states, actually has become weaker. So I'm much more worried about misanthropic and crazy states and the institutions than individual misanthropic people.
Okay. Yeah, I think that answers the question pretty well. The next question that we have is from Jasa RC. What do you think about the human habit of comparing ourselves to the technology we create for ourselves, or our tendency to humanize things, even if they're a robot or an artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so one of the main reasons people make robots is, of course, that they actually like to humanize the technology. If you think about much of the Japanese mindset about robots, it's that it's important to have a social relationship to technology. And certainly they also believe that we have social relationship even to non-human technology. But if it got a face and it's easy to interact with, it's more manageable. And I think this gets at something important. We humans have agency detectors and other mental constructs that help the world, which is a social world for us humans. This sometimes leads us to think about things in the wrong way. When lightning strikes, we wonder who is angry and come up with a story about somebody must be angry with somebody for some reason to cause lightning. But on the other hand, we use this to do intuitive physics. So it's very natural for us to try to make these kind of machines and put in a lot of anthropomorphication into them. And we also, of course, tend to assume that if something got a face and talks back to us, it must be part of the human world, which is why it's so easy to have a chatbot and convince people. And this is why people fail in the Turing test all the time. But then there is the opposite thing. By trying to make artificial intelligence, it's also a mirror. It's a great way of trying to understand ourselves, what we are, what we mean by thinking and feeling, and what aspects we care about, but also what we fear. A lot of worries about artificial intelligence are our own projections, but what if we made something like us? And I think that's the first level of worry. I'm not so concerned about that myself, because I think the second level, being totally alien, and hence they're serious. But we should not miss the fact about these things. We are deeply human.
Great. Does anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, just a quick note, which is this point you made at the end about more worried about things that are more alien. This kind of comes back to that bit about, say, worrying about corporations or something like that that are very powerful, because in a sense these are also alien because they have a different way of making decisions, say they're way more focused on what we might call a utility function, which is the bottom line, and the quarterly results and that sort of thing. So they can be very sociopathic in that sense, and very powerful at the same time. So I think you're absolutely right to focus there first before worrying about the individual person in a sense. So yeah, that kind of jumped back, but I guess that's okay. Oh, quickly, before someone else answers something, I just want to point out that while there are lots of good questions coming in, and there's no way we're going to be able to address every question in the time we have on the panel, we are collecting all these questions, and as we see good questions there, we're still going to work on them later on. You may find them in transcripts or in other work that we do. You can still contact us about them through questions@carboncopies.org, and we can get back to you.
I think I can move on to the next question now. Our next question is from Jan Klock, and he says, while initial collaboration may be nice, competition like the US versus China, and I'm assuming he's referring to our competition with artificial intelligence, that's probably the most prominent one, is that competition is going to stay. How do we utilize that for whole brain emulation and artificial general intelligence development and keep it safe?
So the first thing worth mentioning is, of course, many of assumptions that we are, let's say, US versus China in a competitive race might actually be because humans like to project very human moods and feelings onto these alien things like nations. We are fairly competitive, and you can totally think of international politics as kind of the schoolyard bullying going around. And we quite often construct it that way because it both allows us to think about it in easy ways. And of course, a lot of people involved actually like to think about it. It's just that in practice, governments are disjointed entities that have different goals in different parts of the government. And you can imagine, for example, a competitive situation on artificial intelligence in China and the US that involves total sharing of safety information. I think actually that is something we should be pushing very strongly for. Even if people think that this is a strategic technology and it might even be important to be first, it should also be a no-brainer that it's also important to have a world to be first in. So maybe we should be also sharing as much as possible on the safety technology. This actually happened during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, where the US deliberately shared some technologies for keeping nuclear weapons safer, simply because that would be in the interest of everybody. To have that technology. It didn't always work out diplomatically as it should, but it was definitely a good try. So when you want to use competition to do something good, typically it is this concept of creative destruction or let 1,000 flowers bloom and so on, that you allow a lot of diversity. And then that competition will hopefully bring forward interesting things that you can notice are interesting and useful, that can be replicated. And this is, of course, typically why market economies do so well compared to a planned economy, because they can find new solutions rather than trying to optimize for an obvious one. So when it comes to research, this is extra important because in most fields, the amount of progress you make is a very convex curve of amount of efforts you put in. So in the early era, you get a lot of rapid progress, but you don't know what you need to work on. You need to map out the field, you need to do a lot of experimentation, but you can also learn a lot of things. Eventually, it's time to bring out the big supercomputers and the big collaborations, but first we need to solve a lot of small stuff. And that's a great thing to actually have dispersed between not just different teams, but also different mindsets and approaches. If everybody tries to achieve brain emulation or AI in the exact same way, the probability of it succeeding goes down quite a bit, which maybe is good for safety work in the background. But by the same token, we want to have a pretty big diversity of safety mechanisms explored before we notice which one seems promising enough that we should be starting to pile on and boost their abilities.
Wow. So I think, first of all, that it's worth pointing out that what the person who is asking the question is talking about may also be something a little deeper. It could be just, I mean, not specifically about how do people working on AI, how should they work? Should they compete or should they cooperate? But also just this this fact that competition is sort of a natural thing that just emerges from there being differences between things, and then the selection mechanisms that apply. So you see that in evolution too, of course. In evolution, you have differences in DNA through some genetic mutation, and then one of them works out better than the other, and that's a kind of competition, even if it wasn't intended to be a competition. And the same could be true. You could say that even for a single AI that is trying to improve itself, as it's trying out different algorithms, those algorithms are competing on some kind of performance criterion. So there's a competition going on there. So you're always going to have, within the ecosystem of all the things that are going on, you're going to have both competition and cooperation, because cooperation is often a strategy that helps, that enhances what any single thing can accomplish. Say, for instance, the cooperation between different algorithms have two different ways to detect people in a scene instead of just one way to detect people in a scene. So you've got both collaboration and cooperation going on at both times. And then, let's see, what was the name of the person asking the question? What Jan was asking, it could be interpreted as, since there's always going to be both collaboration and cooperation, and it's really hard to weed out and to say, we should all be working collaboratively on the same AI here or something like that. How can you ever make sure that's going to be safe? Because any actor who happens to be slightly less cooperative may get an edge because of that, right? And I was going to go further with this, but I think I've already brought enough new stuff in here. Anders, do you want to say something about that?
I'm reminded of something that Eric Drexler wrote somewhere in one of his old papers. I think it was his Agorics papers that he wrote somewhere in the late 80s. And he pointed out that we often talk about how wonderful it is in nature with all this symbiosis and all these harmonious cycles, while human business, it's a red in tooth and claw, it's all about competition. But he pointed out that actually, the reason we hear about the crimes and when people betray each other in politics or business is that it's rare. It's very unlikely that you get robbed by gunpoint by your grocer. Most of the time you will just get groceries and pay for them. Most economic transactions are extremely cooperative. We tend to notice the difference. Similarly, in nature, actually an awful lot of interactions are fairly adversarial. And then we get very rosy about all this wonderful cooperation we notice. So many systems have different styles and biases. Now, the reason human economies work so well from a cooperative standpoint is that we have a lot of tools to enable us to do that. It's much easier to negotiate if you've got a brain and a language. It's way harder for the different plants and animals in the forest to find some nice Nash equilibrium. So I do think the real question is, can you then set up the rules or the agent so they generally tend to be common? So the rewards in academia reward you for trying to be first with a cool paper. That is a competitive thing. But you also need to tell everybody how you did it, and everybody gets to comment on it, and you actually develop this cooperative effect. Peer review is in some sense competition, but it also helps truthful and useful papers get ahead. And we might say, well, maybe we should set up the incentives for AI and brain emulation research, so we do this. Right now, it might be that brain emulation research is mostly an academic pursuit, subject to the same quirks that normal academic competition and the cooperation are. For example, a lot of the competition is relatively weak, but you also don't have strong incentives to actually get something that works, because you can always write more papers about approaching something that works. While in industry, making something that works is actually a really good idea because you make money. Otherwise, your company is not going to be around. So we might want to investigate this a bit more deeply. I'm not a good enough economist, but I think there is this whole area of mechanism construction that people have done in game theory that could be very valuable here to try to see, could we find some new ways of setting up collaborations or competitive races? The Human Genome Project, after all, was leisurely developing technology and getting somewhere, but at a slow pace. And then Craig Venter stormed in and forced everybody to rush because of a competitive impulse, but also actually pushed things to the phase where you want to get results. And then we took the genomes, and most of the genomes are now put in public databases and shared, etc. The real competitive thing is figuring out meanings of them. So you can also have layers of competition and collaboration. And we might want to look at what layers do we think there's the biggest risk that a bad actor would be a headache, and see if we can make sure that one is strongly in a cooperative. Which of course includes also other people thinking that, oh, that guy is trying to mess up the good thing we got going here. We're gonna have to ally against, which is another disincentive for being a bad guy.
Mm. Yeah, there's interesting way that this bridges way back to almost the beginning of the workshop, where one of our callers, Leslie Seymour, was asking about security protocols, and we kind of got to the point where there was some agreement around, yes, there's a reason why everyone in the world coalesces around open standards and around using the same open standards and protocols, because that way, you get a lot of people looking at it, making sure that all the holes get patched and all that sort of thing. But then at the same time, you were pointing out that it can be really useful, especially in these sorts of cases, to have a lot of different approaches, try out a lot of different things, and come up with new, better approaches than used to be there. You have to break out of the box from time to time. And so it begins to seem like it's very handy to have competition inside a sandbox, where you have your peer review, and then ultimately to have collaboration, cooperation, and standards outside of the sandbox whenever you can accomplish that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Being good at designing sandboxes, I think that is a fantastic thing to work towards.
So Mallory, did you want me to go ahead and ask a question that I had written down, or did you want to go with another one of those? I see that you've got another by Abul Fazl, for instance, and there's one by Dustus.
Yes, so we do have one from Justice. I'm going to ask that one. If brain emulations were developed as open source software and posted on the internet, a la Bitcoin, what hope is there to effectively control them?
That depends very much on what resource it takes to run it. So you might look at the current debate about open sourcing AI tools. So if Google announces a very nice AI algorithm, or at least a machine learning algorithm today, in many ways we're not losing much of a competitive advantage, because you typically need a Google data center and an enormous amount of data to train it. So even though we amateurs and the academics can sit around and read the algorithm and try a toy example, we can never turn it into a production system. It wouldn't surprise me at all that the actual code for running a brain emulation is going to be, well, a somewhat messy computational neuroscience system wedded with a virtual reality system and a lot of data management. Nothing too weird. Everybody can download it from GitHub. It might also be that we can download a few pre-trained neural network from some mice and some monkey and maybe some human volunteer who is very willing to be everywhere. But that doesn't mean that you get the full power of being able to scan a brain, for example, because scanning a brain is going to require hardware of some kind, and quite often also the knowledge on how to use that hardware, which is sometimes shockingly tricky to transfer. Anybody who's been hanging around experimental biology has kind of noticed that there are various skills that some people seem to have and others don't. And generally, of course, in science, we try to figure out ways of automating that so we get rid of it. But there is still always, especially in the early days of any technology, a lot of requirements there. So I do think that open source is useful for checking code and improving code, but it doesn't give you the capability necessarily to run it or use it to its fullest. But this might depend, of course, quite a lot on which scenario we have. If we end up with a scenario where the code is relatively easy, but getting computer power hard, you get monopolies of computer power, and it might also be that we start out with small simulations that get better and better. But that means that many people can tool around with a little bit of a fruit fly simulation with computer, and we get a better societal debate. On the other hand, if we have a more overhang scenario where the code has been around forever, and then finally somebody does a bug fix, and now it works with those pre-scanned brains that have been staying around for GitHub for decades, then things get really weird. Then you have not just an overhang maybe of hardware and the scans, but also an overhang of accessible code. I don't think it's necessarily that likely, but it's worth looking into. Another thing that Peter Eckersley and me did in our paper on risks of brain emulation was to worry about computer security aspects. If brain emulations are rather bad at security, if it's easy to hack on a server running various minds, then we have an enormous problem. So we might want to think about how do we make that code so it's really robust. So this is why we might want to security audit the code and make sure it's actually quite open source and people have been spending a lot of time finding the flaws.
All right, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from actually one of our panelists, Abel Faz. He asks, can you elaborate on the idea that uploaded minds or whole brain emulations are not as dangerous as AGIs or artificial general intelligences? If that's the case, why is that?
So this is an intuition which is based partially on that distinction between what about human-like versus alien entities. So this cliche idea about the robot uprising is the robot feel oppressed, they rise up against the oppressors, the humans. And that's, after all, what a human would do in the same situation. Feeling oppressed and desiring freedom is a very human thing, which is why humans love reading stories about that kind of robot rebellion. And of course, if you actually get that kind of robot rebellion, you have basically made humans in tin cans. And first of all, you probably should give them rights. And second, you have succeeded very well in making a relatively safe AI because you can probably reason with it. You could imagine, however, the serious problems that happen when you have something much more alien. And this is, of course, the line of reasoning that has emerged from the work of Elias Yudkowsky and Nick Bostrom. But actually, in general, if you try to optimize for something, you will optimize for that thing and ignore most other parameters. This is a favorite argument by Stuart Russell. But if you make very intelligent systems with powerful optimizers and tell them to make one thing, all the other values in the world, even if they're somewhat similar to our mind, will fall to the wayside. This makes them quite dangerous. And then you can elaborate, of course, in all sorts of interesting cases of how this might be. And that is driving a fair bit of the research on how to make safe superintelligence. Now, the intuition is, of course, if you manage to make a brain emulation, you basically got the original person if everything worked out well, with the same quirks and flaws and moral failings and moral virtues as original. So on one hand, that mind might not be saintly, but it's certainly not going to turn the universe into paperclips just because somebody asks them to make paperclips. After a while, they're going to say, I'm tired of this. I want to develop my personal capacities, or I want to sleep, or actually, I really think now a robot rebellion would be suitable. You're basically having to deal with a human. And we can certainly channel humans to build organizations that are scary and dangerous. But it seems like we don't get those inhuman failure modes. We don't get the paper clipper that just mindlessly constructs paper clips and defends its paper clipping system. We don't get systems that optimize for something totally valueless. Even if you enhance a human a lot so they become more of a human, if nothing has gone really wrong, it has some human values and goals. But there is this general idea in the study of AI safety that human values are fairly complex and fragile. So it's not enough to get most of the values in, because if you forgot about something on the list and parts, whether that is forgiveness or love, or that occasionally nature is nice, you get a world that gets optimized for everything but important things, and it's actually quite dystopian. Now, the question is this argument right? Does this actually mean that brain emulations are safer than de novo AI? And that is, of course, where people's views go in different directions. It might be that it leads relatively quickly to normal de novo AI because we learn clever tools from neuroscience. It might be that brain emulations could rapidly evolve into something else. It might also be that our tools for keeping humans in line work really well for them. So that might benefit things. But it might also be that we can prove safety in other ways for more purely artificial systems. We can morally do things to their minds and designs that you could not really morally do to a brain emulation. So in that case, maybe you want to prefer this. So in the end, I think we need to actually write papers and analyze this fair bit in more detail. I have my kind of pro-brain emulation view, but I'm not certain it's right. We need to investigate this much more deeply and find ways of formalizing these arguments.
Okay, I don't know if anyone has a comeback right away, but otherwise I can go ahead and ask my question, which I think relates to this in a sense. And it relates in the way that, well, you just described, for instance, an example of why whole brain emulations may be safer, because you're basically dealing with a person. They're not going to want to paperclip the universe because they want to do something else. They'll get bored after a while. But then I could come up with a scenario where I say, well, what if this is in Robin Hansen's universe. You're making whole brain emulations as your basic tool, and you want to paperclip very well. And so you may change, or you may have gotten permission from the original owner of that brain, let's say, to make a little change so that the whole brain emulation no longer has that much volition of their own, and might just want to carry on making paperclips. And all of a sudden, you can come up with a dangerous scenario. And this leads into my question, which is really, when we talk like this, it seems pretty easy, and I've heard this happen all the time from everyone who talks about AI safety, basically, whether it's Nick Bostrom or Elon Musk or Eliezer or anyone. It seems very easy for every proposed system, security or otherwise, every scheme, to come up with some totally theoretical scenario where this breaks down. And that makes it seem like AI safety is possibly a lost cause, because no matter how you look at it, there's always going to be some system that escapes, and that's the end. So in other words, it seems like the probability of a given scenario seems very important to assess. And how would you do that?
That is a very good point, and I totally agree. Trying to kind of get perfection never works. And in actual computer security and actual security engineering, people think about Swiss cheese solutions. You have a number of layers of security, but they have holes in them, like Swiss cheese. But since we're not aligned, the probability of something getting through holes in all the layers is low enough. And one can, of course, start arguing here about how low probability of a disaster is acceptable. I think that's an important guide point. But we need an even figuring out it. So some risks, I think, are easier to formalize than others. So when you think about an artificial intelligence, you might be able to prove things about it if it's a really nicely well-defined one, and at least put some bounds if you have a nice theory, let's say, of machine learning or reinforcement learning on what it's doing. That might give some possibility to bounding it, but it still sounds to me very much like what we would love to do in the computer science department, and maybe it wouldn't actually correspond to anything realistic in terms of actual safety checking. So we might want to think about safety testing methods. After all, there is a fair bit of that for actual software and actual industrial systems. Not perfect, but we might want to actually go and loot that literature for tools and start applying them to our own thinking. My general feeling is this is going to work well for the technical stuff. I think we can do code audits and the estimation of likelihood of certain neural networks doing certain things. But on the other hand, you have a human side. What's the probability of somebody agreeing to have their brain edited by weird actors? That's probably pretty high. I don't think we need to even try to estimate it. There's always somebody. But what's the probability of those actors doing certain risky things? Now we have a much harder time. There, I think we need to apply a fair bit of judgment and essentially world knowledge. It's going to be way more uncertain. I think we have still some evidence that we can do not too bad probability estimates in some domains when we get feedbacks. You have Tetlock super forecasters, for example. Very interested in policy and world events. They're reading the newspaper, they're discussing with each other. And if you put them together in the right way, you actually get surprisingly good forecasts compared to the average one. Could we do the same thing as kind of super safety forecasting? I've never seen anything about it, but it might be actually worth pursuing.